Okay, welcome to the second lecture in my second lecture series for psychological aspects of drug use and abuse. What I'm going to do in this lecture is just continue kind of where I left off, talking about some of the consequences of drug use. And really what we're trying to do here is focus on how we answer the question, is drug use a problem? This may seem like kind of an obvious question, but as I think we saw in the last lecture, it can be fairly complicated to answer, as are, I suppose, all good questions. So recall from last time that one way to think about the dangerousness or the riskiness of drug use is in terms of toxicity, and this can mean the danger that using drugs poses to physical health or indeed to mental health. And as you'll recall, hopefully, there are different ways that we can evaluate toxicity for drugs and different ways we can compare drugs to decide is one relatively more toxic than the other. Another way to think about the problems associated with drug use or the riskiness of drug use is the likelihood that addiction or dependence will occur when someone begins using a drug. Now, there may be some drugs out there which are relatively benign and for which addiction is not much of a problem. For instance, yesterday when I recorded the previous lecture, I mentioned that I was drinking coffee, and coffee of course contains caffeine, and for most people caffeine is a pretty benign drug. It's also fairly addictive, but being addicted to it isn't really cause for much concern for most healthy people. Outside of the example of caffeine, there are probably few other drugs for which addiction is not at least some concern. And thus, if we're thinking about drug use behaviors and trying to evaluate how problematic or how risky they are, addiction is part of that calculation or part of that evaluation. And indeed, that's what I'm going to focus on in today's lecture. Now, a third way we can think about the problems associated with drug use or the risks associated with drug use are the type of social outcomes that follow, or at least can sometimes follow, from drug use. And crime and violence are two, and not the only two, but two of the more important ones. I'll get to that in the next lecture. So again, for today's lecture, for this lecture I should say, I'm really going to focus on that second criterion for evaluating the riskiness or the dangerousness of drug use, that criterion being addiction or dependence. And I'm going to talk a little bit about different ways of thinking about dependence. I'm also going to talk about how dependence is formally diagnosed by psychiatrists, psychologists, and other healthcare providers. And I'm also going to address an interesting related question, which is who becomes dependent? Who are the people who get addicted to drugs? Because as you probably know, or as you might well guess, not all users become addicted to drugs. Not to say you can't have problems with drugs without being addicted, but not all users get addicted. So it's interesting to ask, why is it that some people who use some drugs tend to become addicted to those drugs, and while other people do not? I'll try and tackle, or at least address, some parts of that question. Okay, so thinking about dependence. Okay. Here's a question for you, and maybe this is just to kind of get us started in this lecture today, get you thinking, if you're not already thinking. Ask yourself this question. Why do people become dependent on drugs? Again, it may seem kind of simple, kind of obvious, but I think if you consider it a little bit, if you poke at the question a little bit, it will reveal some complexity that's really worth considering. Why is it the case that some people at least become dependent on drugs? And relatedly, why is it these folks continue to use drugs despite having significant negative consequences associated with drug use? In some of the previous lectures, I've referenced and linked to videos, including videos from the HBO Addiction series. There are certainly many others that you can find on the internet which highlight and show how problematic drug use can be, and how for some people the tendency to use drugs despite significant negative consequences is evident or is a problem. So why is it that people become dependent on drugs? Why is it that at least some people will continue to use drugs despite having negative consequences? Why is it that some people find it very difficult to quit or to at least cut down their use of drugs? Okay, lots of questions that kind of flow out from that basic question. Let's try and address at least a couple of the important parts of the answers here. One part of the answer has to do with withdrawal symptoms. Now, not all drugs, but many drugs, arguably most drugs, have associated withdrawal syndromes. A syndrome is just a collection of symptoms. When we're talking about the symptoms of withdrawal, these are just the symptoms that occur when drug use stops. They can be acute withdrawal symptoms, like the symptoms that occur almost immediately after ceasing drug use, or they can be more chronic or protracted withdrawal symptoms that may show up days or weeks or even months later. Generally speaking, withdrawal symptoms are the opposite of the withdrawal symptoms are experienced as kind of the opposite, or sort of the dark mirror image of the symptoms of drug use itself. So, or the effects of drug use itself. So for instance, if you are taking a drug like caffeine in your coffee or your tea or your sports drink or whatever, of course you're aware that taking caffeine makes you feel a little bit more alert. It may make you a bit sweaty. It may make your heart race a little faster. The withdrawal symptoms for caffeine are roughly the opposite of that. You feel a bit tired. You can feel a bit sort of like your heart is being a bit sluggish, kind of the mirror image. With other drugs which have stronger effects, we see stronger withdrawal symptoms. For instance, the effects of using heroin can include, of course, a significant numbing of pain. People who are on heroin or other opiates often feel as if they're kind of floating in a very comfortable, numb place. But of course, when they stop using the drug, they experience withdrawal, and one aspect of withdrawal is the opposite of that numb, warm feeling. It's a kind of an achy, pained feeling where everything in the world sort of is hurtful or uncomfortable to the person's body. So we'll talk in the future, or I'll talk in the future, about specific drugs and their specific withdrawal syndromes. Not all drugs have withdrawal syndromes. Most do, or at least most of the ones we're interested in do. And generally speaking, they're kind of the opposite of the effects that we see when the person is actually on the drug, or experiences when he or she is actually taking the drug. Now, these withdrawal is a complex phenomenon. It probably deserves more attention than I'm going to give it right now. But one thing I do want to highlight is that these withdrawal symptoms, these features of the overall withdrawal syndrome for a particular drug, are related to what are generally called opponent processes in the body. Now, opponent processes themselves are a complex set of phenomena, but basically they boil down to this. When you take a drug, your body, whether you realize it or not, works actively to counteract the effect of that drug. So, for instance, if you are taking caffeine into your body, the caffeine is causing your heart rate to accelerate, but your body is kind of pushing back against that, trying to decelerate your heart. So of course, when the caffeine goes away, when it's metabolized from your body, and when you stop drinking more coffee or stop drinking more sports drink, your body takes a little while to catch up, and during that catch-up period, it is continuing to push back and to slow down your heart, even though there's no more caffeine there to accelerate your heart. So that opponent process, that balancing out effect, contributes to, in large part, some of the symptoms of withdrawal that we see for drugs. So here's an image that kind of depicts what I'm talking about. You could imagine someone here is using drugs. In the top graph, this is the first time they use drugs. In the middle graph, it's maybe the second or third or the fourth time they've used drugs. And then the last graph at the very bottom, it's what they are like after they've quit using drugs. And the red line that you can see at the top depicts just any a kind of drug effect that could occur. It might be acceleration in heart rate, or it could be increased pupil dilation, or it could be decreased stomach acid secretion, or it could be sort of increased pain tolerance, or anything. We're just kind of imagining some sort of hypothetical effect. You can see what happens initially when the person takes a drug is they experience that strong drug effect, for most drugs, let's say. Later on, as the person is using drugs more and more, their body is mounting a kind of a defense or a counter response, and that counter response in the middle graph is depicted by the dotted green line that dips below sort of the horizon, if you will. Now that dotted green line is balancing out the dotted red line, so the subjective experience that the user actually has is that they don't feel quite as much of the effect as they initially felt. This is actually related to another phenomenon called tolerance, but for the time being, what I'm trying to do is show you how it is the result of opponent processes. Again, let's imagine that the red line is heart rate acceleration from caffeine use. After you've been using caffeine for a while, maybe you drink coffee every day, your body, whether you realize it or not, is counteracting that caffeine. It's working to slow down your heart every time you start drinking coffee. That's the dotted green line going down. And so what you subjectively might notice when you're drinking coffee is that your heart rate goes up a little bit, but not as much probably as you noticed it go up the first time you drank coffee. Or if you felt kind of a sort of a pleasant numbing sensation the first time you used an opiate, after you've been using it for a while, that numbing sensation isn't nearly so strong. Then of course later on, after you have stopped using your drug, that's the bottom graph here, there is no red line, there's no solid or dotted red line anymore because there's no drug effect because you're no longer using the drug. But that opponent process, or those opponent processes, because there may be several, linger for some period of time even after you stopped using drugs. It takes a while for your body to adjust to the fact that you're no longer on drugs. So again, what you might find, to use a kind of a benign example or a commonplace example, is if you decide to quit drinking coffee or quit taking caffeine of any sort, for whatever reason you decide to stop, you might find that for a period of days or even weeks after you quit, let's say your morning coffee, in the morning, around the time you would otherwise be having coffee, you might feel especially sluggish, even more so than you normally do in the morning. Just kind of like, can't really move, really tired. You might even notice that your heart rate is kind of slow. That is because your body's counter response is still kind of kicking along for a while, but it has nothing to push back against. So the slowdown, the unnecessary slowdown, really dips your heart rate down quite a bit. That bottom graph would be maybe even more accurate if it depicted kind of a blue line, a sort of a subjective experience of the effect, which dipped quite low, kind of tracing along with that dotted green line. Bottom line is, opponent processes, bottom line, no pun intended, I suppose, is that opponent processes occur, they are implicated in phenomena like tolerance and withdrawal, and what's important for us to consider right now is that some people will continue using drugs to avoid withdrawal symptoms. I mean, we see this in the, caffeine for, in coffee and tea and sports drinks. You may want to stop drinking Red Bull or coffee or tea, but you might choose to continue using that drug, caffeine, in those beverages just because you notice that when you stop you feel kind of crummy. A more severe example of this might be if you are a user of opiates, perhaps you abuse OxyContin or perhaps you use heroin, you might find that you might decide that you want to quit, but you find that when you do try to cut down or try to go to quit, to go cold turkey, to stop using entirely, that you feel really bad. You experience strong, unpleasant withdrawal symptoms, and those are bad enough that you decide to go back to using just to get away from them. This phenomenon is sometimes called physical dependence, and I'll kind of address this point a little bit further on. That the phrase physical dependence, the word physical, is maybe a little bit of a misnomer. But this idea of physical dependence, experiencing unpleasant effects, is implicated in the fact that people can sometimes continue using drugs even after they, in terms of their judgment and their attitudes, no longer really want to use. If you think back to your introductory psychology class, if you've taken one, this may remind you a little bit of a basic process which is identified in learning. That is operant conditioning. Operant conditioning occurs anytime a behavior is reinforced and that behavior is repeated. So for instance, if a given behavior that someone engages in, whether it produces a reward, that person is likely to continue doing that behavior. Also, if a behavior removes a punishment, that behavior will continue. So those are respectively positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. But the idea is anytime an animal or a human engages in a behavior that either gives them a reward or removes a punishment, it's likely that that behavior will continue over time. And that behavior can be something like, every day at 4 o'clock, you walk by a coffee shop and you see that they have cupcakes and you like cupcakes and you eat a cupcake and it tastes delicious and it feels good in your stomach, and so that's a reward, and it's likely that you'll repeat that behavior over time. That reinforcement can also occur if you do something that removes an unpleasant feeling. So every day at 4 o'clock you feel an urge to smoke a cigarette because that's the time that you normally smoke, and if you try and resist that urge you feel pretty crummy and you smoke and the bad feeling goes away, that punishment goes away, you're likely to continue the behavior of smoking every day at 4 o'clock, even if in some personal subjective place you really would not like to smoke, you'd like to quit, you're still being reinforced by the removal of those punishing withdrawal symptoms. And again, some of this may be familiar to you from your introductory psychology class. You probably learned about the work of the behaviorists, people like Watson and Skinner and other folks in the middle part of the 20th century who did lots of research, much of it with non-human animals like rats, who were put in cages where they would engage in behaviors like, for instance, pressing a lever, maybe pressing a lever when a certain signal was given, like a light going on or a tone being broadcast through a speaker. And if that behavior, the lever press, either provided a reward, for instance, produced a pellet of food, which the rat wanted, or removed a punishment, for instance, stopping the electrical shock on the grid of the floor, then the rat would very quickly learn to do the behavior again and again. So if the rat's in the cage and it notices just by accident that if it presses the lever, a pellet appears, it's likely to keep pressing that lever. If a rat's in the cage and the cage floor occasionally will shock the rat, which is of course unpleasant, and the rat notices, perhaps at first by accident, that if it bumps into the lever, the shock stops, the rat quickly learns to press the lever to prevent that shock from happening. Positive reinforcement for the pellet, negative reinforcement from the shock stopping, those are both forms of reinforcement. Those are both forms of operant conditioning. So to bring that around to our discussion of drugs, if we have someone who's continuing to use drugs to avoid withdrawal symptoms, which are unpleasant almost by definition, they're really very little about withdrawal is nice or fun. Withdrawal is punishing. If you continue using to avoid those punishing feelings, we sometimes describe this as physical dependence. Physical because a lot of the symptoms of withdrawal are physical in nature. They're aches, pains, sick feelings, etc. Although, again, this is a bit of a misnomer because not all withdrawal symptoms have to be physical. However, a lot of the initial study of this occurred with people like heroin addicts and other folks who have withdrawal symptoms which are often quite physical in nature. An important point to drive home here, and I guess I'm being a little bit repetitious, is that this is operant conditioning via negative reinforcement. If a drug use removes withdrawal symptoms, if going back to using the drug, if stopping your plan to quit removes withdrawal symptoms, it's likely that drug use will continue. And if you talk to people who are smokers, they will often, cigarette smokers that is, they'll often describe wanting to quit but having a hard time because every time they try they feel kind of crummy and sick. If you talk to people who have addictions or are dependent on opiates like heroin or OxyContin or Vicodin or whatever, you'll often hear them say, I would like to quit but I don't want to get sick when I stop, so I'm going to keep going on with my drug use. Again, this is called physical dependence, but as I've already said, it's not really a good name because withdrawal symptoms aren't only physical. For instance, if you use cocaine for a period of time and then you stop, you may feel depressed afterwards. You may feel sad and like life doesn't really have a lot of pleasure or reward left for you. Now, that's a kind of a subjective, emotional experience. It's not particularly physical in nature, but it would still count as negative reinforcement, and it might be somewhat awkwardly shoehorned in under the heading of physical dependence, because the idea is you might want to go back to using cocaine just to get away from that unpleasant feeling, even though it's a more of an emotional, psychological feeling than a physical one. And Just to be clear about it, drugs with strong withdrawal symptoms, with strong syndromes, collections of symptoms, tend to be fairly high risk in terms of physical dependence. So if we look at a drug like nicotine, especially in cigarettes, or if we look at the various opiates, like here's some pictures of OxyContin, these are drugs which, if you use them and then stop or cut down, you'll feel kind of crummy. There's a strong punishing withdrawal syndromes associated with these drugs. These are drugs which tend to be fairly addictive, and obviously you know that cigarettes are addictive, and hopefully you know that opiates like OxyContin here are addictive. So that's part of the answer as to why people can get addicted to drugs. It's withdrawal and negative reinforcement that perpetuates use. But of course, not all drugs have strong withdrawal symptoms. So marijuana is an example of a drug which, if you use enough of it and if you use strong marijuana, you certainly can experience withdrawal. But relative to other drugs that we're going to talk about, the withdrawal symptoms for marijuana are not typically very strong. And then there are other drugs like LSD, pictured here on the bottom, which have, as far as we know, no withdrawal symptoms at all. If you use LSD and then you stop, you don't have a bad feeling afterwards, at least most users don't. We rarely see anyone reporting that. And yet people can certainly become addicted to marijuana. It's not as clear that people can become addicted to LSD, but clearly people can engage in patterns of use of these drugs. So the question remains open: why do people use drugs if it's not just to get rid of bad feelings? And clearly part of that answer is that some people use drugs for pleasurable effects. Now that may seem entirely obvious, but it's worth lingering upon. People use drugs to avoid unpleasant feelings or unpleasant effects like withdrawal symptoms. People use drugs to enjoy pleasurable effects. Those can be distortions in perception that are fun or amusing, or pleasant sensations that are experienced in the body. Now these sensations and these experiences we sometimes lump together under a heading that we call psychological dependence. So if someone continues using a drug because they continue to desire the pleasurable effects of that drug, again, that sometimes, or at least historically, has been called psychological dependence. An important thing to notice here is that this is drug use that is maintained via positive reinforcement, operant conditioning that occurs from positive reinforcement. If a behavior gives you a reward, you're likely to engage in that behavior again. So if drug use gives you pleasant feelings, you're likely to continue using drugs again and again for longer and longer periods of time. And again, this is called psychological dependence. It's not really a good name. It's a little bit like saying physical dependence is not really a good name. Psychological dependence, likewise, is not really a good name, because the pleasurable effects that occur from drug use don't have to be purely psychological. So it isn't just the case that the pleasures of drugs are in the way they change your thinking or the way they change your emotions. You can experience physical sensations which are quite pleasant. So again, psychological dependence, it's a name that's been used in the past. It still is used somewhat. It has some value to be aware of. What's more important, I think, is to notice that this is drug use that's maintained via positive reinforcement. Again, it produces a reward. It's a behavior that you'll tend to engage in again and again and again. Now, I've already mentioned operant conditioning, but if you think back to your introductory psychology class, you may also recall that there's another type of basic learning that occurs in all animals, including humans, and that's called classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is where one stimulus gets associated with another through repeated pairings. So if I have one stimulus and I present it alongside with another, that other stimulus can serve as a stand-in or a cue or signal for the original stimulus. The most famous examples of classical conditioning come, of course, from Pavlov's research with dogs, and if you don't remember this from your introductory psychology class, just indulge me in a brief explanation. Dogs, like many animals, probably like humans too, certainly like humans too, have an unconditioned response to the presentation of food. That is, they tend to salivate when food is shown to them. So salivation, drooling, is an unconditioned response. Food is an unconditioned stimulus because these things tend to be connected just naturally in the real world. A neutral stimulus like a whistle or a bell in some of Pavlov's original work doesn't normally elicit salivation. If you walk up to a dog and blow a whistle, it might look at you, but it probably won't start to drool. Now imagine that you or Pavlov or some similar person interested in classical conditioning presented food and also blew a whistle in front of a dog repeatedly over time. So every time the dog sees its food and starts to salivate, you also blow the whistle. So food, salivate, whistle, food, salivate, whistle, food, salivate, whistle. You do that a number of times. Pretty soon, the whistle alone, even without the food present, will elicit the response of salivation. At this point, we might say that the salivation is now a conditioned response because it's occurring as a response or as a consequence of a conditioned stimulus. Whistling, or the sound, the bell, whatever the stimulus was. Originally, the whistle had no connection to salivation. Now it has a classically conditioned connection to salivation. So why am I telling you this? What's the important connection here to drugs and to some of the problems we're talking about with drug dependence? Well, when you use drugs, there are all sorts of stimuli in the environment that go along with drug use, some of which you may be aware of, a lot of which you probably won't be aware of. What happens for people and other animals too when we use drugs is those stimuli in the environment become associated with the drug itself and with the experiences that occur as a consequence of drug use. The problem there is if you look at someone who's cut down their use of drugs or has quit their use of a particular drug, those cues in the environment may still trigger for him or for her the urge to use drugs. So just like Pavlov's dogs responding to a whistle even when the food isn't around, a human drug user or ex-user can respond to the presence of a cue with a craving to use drugs even if those drugs are no longer present. And so an example of this, and I imagine, well, I've heard people talk about this, back when I used to live in Florida during the very end of the 1990s and into the early 2000s, electronic dance music was very popular. It probably still is. I'm getting a bit too old for it, I suppose. And certainly there is a drug culture that goes along with electronic dance music. And I remember talking to friends who'd been very active in the early dance music rave scene and had used a fair bit of drugs when they would go out to clubs or go out to festivals to listen to dance music. And they found that at least some of them found that even after they stopped using drugs, merely the presence of that type of music would get them kind of craving to use drugs again. So if someone had cut down or stopped using cocaine or LSD or ecstasy, but then later on in their life, maybe for old time's sake just decided to listen to some techno music, they might find themselves kind of craving to use drugs again. The reason being that even though they might not have realized it at the time, that music got associated with their use of the drug, with the drug itself and also the effects of the drug use, and became a conditioned cue for the response of drug craving. And that can occur in the example of these friends I used to have. It can also occur in other settings as well. It might be the case that every time you sit down to your laptop to do some work, on some homework or to watch one of my lectures, you have a cup of coffee. Even if you don't realize it, the laptop in front of you might become conditioned with the drug caffeine in your coffee. And you may find that later on, if you open up your laptop, you sort of have this vague sense of like, it'd be nice to have some coffee now. You might not even understand why you're all of a sudden craving to have coffee. Well, it could be because there's a classically conditioned association such that a laptop, which of course has nothing to do with with coffee per se, has for you become conditioned and associated with coffee. As a side point, I'd like to just point out that advertisers know this. So the advertisers of drugs, at least the illicit drugs like alcohol, of course, especially, often use associations to increase craving for drugs. So why is it that we often think about alcohol as going along with sex or going along with good times? Well, probably some of us have had sex while drinking or after drinking, and probably some of us have had good times drinking alcohol. But all of us from a very young age have been exposed to various advertising campaigns, whether on television or in billboards or magazines, that make a connection between fun and especially sex with the use of alcohol. So that many of us, I think you could argue quite reasonably, have classically conditioned associations between alcohol and fun even before we really start doing things like drinking or start having sex or start going to parties. An interesting thing to think about. Psychology has studied this, and advertising for decades has taken advantage of this. So what's an important point to make here, or a relevant point? We're asking the question, why do people become addicted to drugs? Well, part of it probably has to do with physical dependence. That is, that for some drugs that have strong withdrawal symptoms or syndromes, those drugs can be quite addictive. We can also look at psychological dependence and say that drugs which have strong rewarding effects, which can be very pleasant or kind of very satisfying to the body, also can be risky for inspiring dependence, but because of these psychological effects, the psychological dependence. So if you look like a drug like cocaine or a drug like alcohol, for most people these drugs produce fairly strong, fairly positive effects, and thus they can be quite addictive because people understandably desire to have those strong positive effects again. Now, an important point here, drug use, and especially dependence or addiction on drugs, can involve both of these processes. It's not just that as simple as to say, well, for some people it's physical dependence and some people it's psychological dependence. It certainly can be the case that people can show evidence or can have the experience of physical dependence, that is, trying to avoid withdrawal symptoms and continuing drug use via negative reinforcement. It can also be the case that people can use drugs and even become dependent on drugs because of psychological dependence, because of their ongoing desire to experience positive or pleasurable effects, and thus drug use can be maintained by positive reinforcement of behavior. For any one person, both of these processes may be operating. It may be one first and then the other second, or even both at the same time. In past semesters, a student recommended to me a song by the hip-hop artist Lil Wayne, and the song's called I Feel Like Dying. I'll link to it on the Blackboard website for this lecture. It's probably one of the few Lil Wayne songs I can link to in good conscience because the amount of profanity and, shall we say, adult language is fairly limited in this song. It's about, though as many of Wayne's songs are, it's about his use of drugs, and it describes both the pleasant experiences of drugs and the unpleasant experiences when drug use stops. And so the chorus and indeed the title of the song, I Feel Like Dying, refer to when the drugs are gone. When he stops using, he feels terrible. He feels like dying. So he is, at least in the song and maybe in his real life, describing the use of drugs both out of desire for the positive experiences, the positive reinforcement, the psychological dependence, if you want to call it that, and also using drugs to avoid the negative experiences, the negative reinforcement for use, continuing drugs, the physical dependence, if we want to call it like that. It's a really good song. Another point to make is that in the HBO series Addiction, which I've referenced already a few times, this is just an image of the DVD set that I have, and you can see, if you look closely, the title that appears above the title says, why can't they just stop? This is a question that often friends and family members of folks with drug use problems ask out of frustration, out of concern. Why can't this person just stop drinking? Why can't they just stop smoking weed? It's clearly a problem for them. Well, the reason that they can't stop, or the reasons that they can't stop, can be complicated and can involve some of the processes that I've just talked about: physical dependence and psychological dependence. And again, I've already said this, but it's worth repeating. Part of the story of why people can't stop, or at least can't stop or have difficulty stopping drug use, is because drug use is often, and often unconsciously or unawarely, paired with all sorts of stimuli in the environment. Via classical conditioning. So just like the dog who salivates in response to the bell, we as drug users, if we're trying to quit or cut down, can experience craving that might occur even very suddenly as a consequence of being presented with cues of drug use. And I'm actually going to link to a video in the HBO Addiction series that talks about some of the scientific research in this area into cue responses for drugs. It profiles an ex-user of crack cocaine and some research that he is volunteering to participate in that is exploring the speed with which his brain can respond to cues associated with cocaine, even at a very unconscious level. It's a really fascinating bit of video. Like I said, I'll link to it on the Blackboard website so that you can check it out. Okay, so I've been talking for a little bit. It's maybe worth me taking a pause and you doing some thinking or asking yourself the question, does this apply to you? Consider a drug that you use. And to be clear, this doesn't need to be an illicit drug. I've used the example of coffee, or more precisely of caffeine in coffee and tea, a number of times because of course this is a illicit drug. It's a drug that many people use. Ask yourself, is your use of coffee, is your use of sports drinks or tea, or is your use of some other drug, even an illicit drug, maintained by negative reinforcement? Is it maintained by positive reinforcement? Is it maintained by both? Is it associated with cues in the environment that you can think of that maybe trigger craving to use drugs? Again, I would argue that in general, when you're trying to learn anything new, maybe things especially in psychology, it's valuable for you to think about your own life and try and create connections between what you're learning and what is going on in your real life as best as you can. If you can make those connections or see how what you're hearing in the lecture or what you're reading in your text, how that connects with your life, it's likely that you'll remember the material, that will be meaningful to you, and it will maybe inform the types of decisions you make in your life, which is really the goal of education anyway. So take a few minutes and think about it, and when you're ready, move on in the video and we'll see what comes up next. Okay, I've talked a little bit about about different processes that are involved in dependence, different ways that we can think about dependence. What I'd like to do now is talk about diagnosis. That is, how we formally identify someone as being dependent on a drug or not. And the first thing to notice is that when we say the word dependence, we're referring to what is commonly understood as addiction. The word addiction has not been used as a diagnosis for quite a few years, in part because addiction means different things to different people, because it's used casually in conversation, like, oh, I'm addicted to playing my Xbox, or oh, I'm addicted to chocolate. Also because it has, at least for some people, a very negative connotation. So quite a few years ago, psychologists, psychiatrists, and other healthcare providers got away from using the word addiction and used the word dependence. It's interesting to note that in the current diagnostic system, the DSM-5, the word dependence is kind of being abandoned as well and being replaced with a more generic sounding phrase, substance use disorder. So you might diagnose someone as having a substance use disorder for alcohol, for cocaine, for marijuana, for almost any other drug. Depending on how you sort of characterize that substance use disorder, you can be referring to some of the features of what we used to call dependence and what we even used to before that call addiction. So DSM-5, substance use disorder, basically is characterized as a problematic pattern of substance use, that is, using a drug in ways that lead to a lot of negative outcomes. I've talked about this a little bit in the previous lecture. What's also interesting about DSM-5 is that the diagnostic system allows for a rating of severity based on the number of criteria of problems that are endorsed by the user. So if you were meeting with a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a licensed therapist or a psychiatric nurse, he or she might sit down and go through a checklist of symptoms, asking you questions about them and making notes so that he or she could decide, do I want to diagnose this person with a substance use disorder or not? And if I do diagnose them, how severe would I rate that substance use disorder? Now those criteria include things like the items on the screen right now, and I won't read through all of them, but things like using more of the drug than you really wanted to, experience craving for the drug, having all sorts of problems associated with using the drug, experiencing tolerance for the drug, which I've talked about already and which I'll talk about a lot more in future lectures, and experiencing withdrawal from when you stop using the drug or when you cut down. Now, to be clear, you don't need all of these criteria in order to be diagnosed as having a substance use disorder. You just need a kind of a minimum, you have to exceed a minimum threshold of these criteria. And it kind of depends on how the diagnosis is being developed, how many the diagnostician would really want to see. But if you had some or even all of these criteria met for your substance use, it's very likely that you could be diagnosed with having substance use disorder. Now, an important point that I think emerges from this is that dependence is a complex phenomenon. Dependence or substance use disorder is a complex phenomenon. It can involve different criteria, combinations of criteria, and thus can be different for different people. So if you had two people next to each other, both of whom are diagnosed as having substance use disorder, they might actually individually have a quite different set of symptoms or criteria met for them. So it's not as simple as to say all addiction is the same, or all dependence is the same, or all substance use disorder is the same. There are some common features, but an individual person might be very different in terms of his combination of features or criteria from another individual person. So it's an important point to make. Another important point to make, or an interesting point to make, is that not every user becomes dependent. Now, maybe this seems obvious to you. In some ways it's now obvious to me, but it's funny. I reflect on how I was raised and the type of messages I got when I went to school or saw public service announcements about drugs or what I heard from adults in my life. And there was at least a period of time where I thought, if you use drugs, you will get addicted. And it's worth noting that that does happen for some people. And that can be really problematic for them, of course, but it does not happen for most people, even for most users of drugs which are generally considered very addictive. So I'll link to some references on this, but as a quick summary, only about 1 in 5 people who use heroin become addicted to the drug. That is to say, become dependent or on the drug. And only about 1 in 10 people who use cocaine or methamphetamine will become addicted to those drugs, even though those two drugs, heroin, or 3 drugs, heroin, cocaine, and meth, are generally considered very addictive. And they are very addictive. Nonetheless, only a minority of users actually end up becoming dependent. Now, to be really clear, I'm not saying that heroin is safe or that cocaine is safe or that you can just use meth and it's just not a problem, because people can still have problems associated with using, even if they don't meet full criteria for being dependent. Even if they're not, technically speaking, addicted, they can still have a lot of problems in their lives. It's just worth noting and being honest about the fact that dependence is one outcome of drug use, and it's not, for most drugs, a particularly common outcome. So again, addiction is sometimes presented as something that is inevitable. Remember, like use one time and you're hooked. That's just, generally speaking, not true. Now, for a particular user, that might be the case. It could be the case that oh gosh, I remember years ago I worked in a liquor store and I had a coworker who was a very heavy cigarette smoker, and I asked him once about his cigarette use, because at the time I smoked, but I didn't smoke that heavily. My friend really did, and I asked him about how he started, and he said to me, wow, the first time I smoked a cigarette I thought I was in love. Like, he had a very strong feeling, and maybe he would describe that first time as being enough to get him addicted to nicotine. Generally speaking, that's not the case for most users, at least for most drugs. It's not true for most users that they become addicted. It's not true for most drugs that they are addicting to most people. But remember, this is not to say drugs are safe or that you can't have a lot of problems even if you're not technically addicted or technically dependent. So of course this raises another interesting question. Who does become dependent? Because some people do get addicted to drugs. Some people do become dependent on drugs. And some drugs seem more addictive than others. So while we can acknowledge that not everyone is addicted and not every drug is addictive or equally addictive, we can still ask the interesting questions. Who does become dependent? And as is often the case in psychology, the answer is, well, it depends. And in this case, what we mean is it depends on the drug, on how it's used, and also on who is using it. So let's try and unpack those different points in the next few slides. So who does become dependent? Well, not every user becomes dependent. Some drugs are more addictive than others, and to be simplistic, at least a little bit about it, we can say that the drugs which are associated with strong positive and negative reinforcement tend to be more addictive than drugs which are not associated with strong positive and negative reinforcement. So drugs which either give you very strong positive feelings or which give you very strong negative feelings when you stop using them, those are the addictive drugs. So to characterize that, consider LSD. LSD is an incredibly powerful drug. Very small amounts of the drug can have a very strong effect on the human mind. You can take literally micrograms of the drug and you can hallucinate for hours. Those hallucinations can be very compelling and confusing to people. The interesting thing though is hallucinations from LSD are not always positive. They're not always negative. Most people describe them as being really weird, but it's not exactly like you take LSD and you feel really, really good. You might, but generally speaking, you just have a weird experience that people sometimes call a trip when you use LSD. When you stop using LSD, as far as we know, there's almost no withdrawal. So you don't feel particularly bad if you use LSD, even if you use it a lot and then stop using it. You don't feel sick, you don't feel sad, you don't feel anything particularly unusual. So LSD, as powerful a drug as it is, has neither a particularly strong pattern of positive reinforcement nor a particularly strong pattern of negative reinforcement. Compare that to cigarettes. Now granted, when you first start smoking, if you start smoking, and please don't start smoking because it's a filthy habit and it's very bad for you, but let's say you do, or let's say you have, as I have in the past. Once you get the hang of smoking, when you smoke, it feels good. It feels relaxing. It feels like it focuses your mind and kind of puts you in this sort of alert yet kind of attentive, relaxed yet alert frame of mind that feels positive. And certainly when you stop smoking, you feel pretty crappy. You feel, like you lose your appetite, or you feel overly hungry, you have trouble sleeping, you have trouble having a bowel movement when you go to the bathroom, all sorts of stuff which is frankly very unpleasant. So nicotine in cigarettes has both fairly strong positive reinforcement and quite strong negative reinforcement. Thus, in this way, we can fairly say, I think, that nicotine is more addictive than LSD. So why is it the case that not everyone gets addicted to every drug? Well, some drugs are just frankly more addictive than others. A related idea is that not every way of using drugs is equally likely to lead to dependence or to lead to addiction. If you use a drug in a way that encourages very quick, very strong effects, it's more likely to lead to a dependence or addiction than if you use a drug in a way that encourages rather modest or slow effects. So for those of you who drink alcohol, and again, I'm not trying to encourage people to drink alcohol, I certainly hope that those of you who do drink responsibly, you probably know the difference between what it feels like to drink, let's say, a glass of beer or even a glass of wine, and to drink a shot of liquor straight, especially if you gulp it right down. Gulping down shots typically produces a strong intoxication fairly quickly. That pattern of using behavior of drug use is more likely to lead to addiction and dependence than is the more measured, slow pattern of using, because it's associated with stronger positive feelings. You get more of a rush, frankly, from doing shots with your friends probably than from slowly sipping a beer with your friends. And thus, if every day you did shots with your friends, you might be more likely to become addicted to alcohol than if every day you sat down and slowly sipped a beer with your friends. To use the example of tobacco again, I can remember before I started smoking cigarettes, there's a period of time where I was living in Florida, where for a while it was more common to see people smoking cigars. You could buy cigars at a lot of restaurants. You could smoke them in outdoor patios. And so for a while I smoked cigars. And you might not know this, but people who smoke cigars typically just draw the smoke into their mouth. They don't actually inhale the smoke into their lungs. And they can absorb, or you can absorb, a fair bit of nicotine from the tobacco smoke through your mouth. And also you have the pleasant smell of cigar smoke, and you think you're kind of cool because you're smoking a cigar, which you're probably not, because they're kind of gross, really. The point is, the nicotine gets into your body relatively slowly if you smoke a cigar, as compared to if you smoke a cigarette, which is interesting given that a cigarette's much smaller and has much less tobacco. The trick is, when you smoke a cigarette, you almost always draw the smoke right into your lungs, and your lungs have a lot of surface area, and your lungs are very good at absorbing chemicals, such as oxygen, of course, but also chemicals like nicotine. So even though a cigarette's much smaller, if you smoke a cigarette by drawing the smoke into your lungs, you get that nicotine feeling much stronger, much quicker than if you smoke a cigar. And I think this is generally true. It was certainly true in my experience. As soon as I started smoking cigarettes, I didn't want cigars anymore, because I could get my nicotine much faster and much cheaper, I suppose, too, from smoking cigarettes than from smoking cigars. I'm sad to admit, I was addicted to nicotine in cigarettes. I never really felt like I was particularly addicted to cigars. Thankfully, I quit using both sometime later, and again, would not encourage any of you to begin smoking any tobacco, because it's really not very good for you. So the important idea here is that, another important idea here, I guess I haven't quite gotten to that yet, is that not every user becomes dependent. Some ways of using drugs increase risk. If you use a drug in a way that produces a strong positive effect, like shooting a shot of whiskey or smoking a cigarette as compared to smoking a cigar, that will increase the likelihood, relatively speaking, of you becoming addicted. Also, if you use a drug repeatedly, you have greater chances to develop conditioned associations for that drug use. So, if you think about someone who uses a drug like LSD, they might use it once every month, once every 6 months. It might be a drug that they rarely use. Compare that to a drug like nicotine or caffeine, or for some people who smoke marijuana daily, a drug which they use daily. Simply by using a drug more frequently, you give your brain more opportunities to develop patterns of conditioning. Either operant conditioning, where your brain learns that using the drug gives positive feelings and takes away bad feelings, or classical conditioning, where your brain learns that drug use is associated with a variety of cues in your environment, cues which may later on elicit craving for you. So again, if you think about people who smoking, most people who smoke cigarettes smoke a fair number of cigarettes. Even a light smoker, someone who doesn't smoke very much, might still burn down, a half a pack of cigarettes a day, which is, I think, try and remember, let's say a half a pack is about 10 cigarettes. That's 10 drug uses a day. That's someone who doesn't smoke relatively heavily. A heavy smoker might smoke a pack a day, or even 2 packs a day. That's a lot of cigarettes. Someone who drinks coffee might drink a lot of coffee every day. You might drink a cup of coffee in the morning, a cup of coffee in the afternoon. There's certainly been times in my life where I feel like I was constantly drinking coffee. Merely by doing a drug again and again, simply by repeating the behavior, you can build up or increase the likelihood of dependence. I mean, this is a basic phenomenon that we notice for all habits. Even if good habits, like if you want to get in the habit of doing anything, whether it's going to the gym or meditating or doing yoga, or doing some other healthy habit, flossing your teeth. Merely by repeating the behavior, a lot of times you increase the likelihood of getting the habit for it, as compared to if you only rarely do the behavior, like you only rarely go to the gym or you only rarely meditate. You're very unlikely to kind of suddenly pick up the habit out of the blue. I kind of got a little bit ahead of myself a few slides back, but the important idea is that not all drugs and not all ways of using drugs are the same. Some are relatively more risky in terms of inspiring dependence, some are relatively less risky. If you use a drug that has a strong pattern of positive and negative reinforcement, if you use a drug in a way that involves swift activation of those positive feelings and swift removal of those negative feelings, if you use a drug that is just in a way that's just merely repetitious, all of those things can kind of stack the deck or increase the odds of you becoming addicted or dependent on the drug as compared to using a different drug or using a drug in a more measured way. Another answer to the question who becomes dependent is that not every user becomes dependent. Some users, some people are at greater risk for becoming dependent than others. And some of this goes down to basic genetics. If you've taken a class in biology, if you've taken a good introductory psychology class, you've probably heard about heritability. Heritability is a calculation that geneticists and other researchers who are interested in genetics can make. It's an estimate of how much variability in something is due to genetic factors. So in our case, we can be looking at dependence or addiction. And the idea here is that if you look at a population of people, some people are addicted to drugs, other people aren't, so there's variability. Not everyone is the same. And we can ask how much of that variability is likely due to genetics. We might not know specifically which genes, but we can estimate mathematically that some fraction, some portion of that overall pie is due to genetics as compared to other sources. Now, I won't get into the exact calculation of heritability, but suffice it to say for right now that heritability is often denoted as h squared. I'll talk about this in a future lecture, but for the time being I won't. And the higher h squared is between 0 and up to a maximum of 1, the greater the portion of variability in something, in this case in addiction to drugs, can be ascribed to genetic factors. So a very low h squared means that whatever variability we observe in a behavior is entirely due to non-genetic factors, if it's very close to 0. If h squared is pegged up near 1, that means that essentially all of the variability that we observe in a behavior is due to genetic factors. So you can see here these are different estimates of heritability for dependence for different types of drugs and for some non-drug behaviors, or at least one non-drug behavior, gambling. And the solid red blocks or solid red boxes represent an average estimated heritability. The bars outside are error bars denoting confidence intervals, I think 95% confidence intervals, just giving us a sense of the variability in the estimates of heritability from multiple studies. So, not all attempts to look at the heritability of hallucinogens, for instance, have resulted in the same estimate of heritability. The bars represent how varied those estimates of variability are. Suffice it to say that some drugs have higher h squared, have higher heritability than others. So if we look at a drug like cocaine as compared to hallucinogens, it's relatively more heritable. That is, addiction to that drug is relatively more heritable than addiction to hallucinogens. Smoking and alcohol are relatively more addictive, or I shouldn't say more addictive, but they are more heritable. Addiction to them is more heritable than addiction to cannabis or marijuana is. So the point here that we can observe is that not all drugs have the same heritability. So some drugs are more, addiction to some drugs is probably more of a genetic matter than addiction to others. But also we can say that the heritability for most drugs hovers around 40 or 50%. So most of those red blocks are kind of somewhere between 0.4 and 0.5. Some are a little higher, some are a little bit lower, but kind of the average of these estimates is all kind of around 40% or 50% of the variability. Now, what that tells us is that if we look at a given drug, like let's say, cannabis or smoking cigarettes, then we can talk about the heritability of that drug, and we can say that maybe about half of the variability in dependence can be ascribed to genetic factors. So not everyone's addicted to cigarettes, How much of that story can be explained by the fact that some people have genes which make it more likely for them to be addicted? Well, about half of the story, about 50% of the story. The other half of the story has to do with environment, and in most sort of classic studies of heritability, there's kind of a nature versus nurture distinction, to be a bit simplistic about it. The portion of variability that is not explained by genetics, by h squared, is explained by environment. And here we can say that not all users become dependent because some have environments that put them at greater risk for dependence than others. And environments here can be broadly construed to involve, the type of neighborhood you grew up in, the type of behavior you saw in your friends and family. Environment can even include the intrauterine environment. So if you, for instance, if your mother smoked when she was pregnant with you, at least some research suggests that will increase your likelihood for becoming dependent on nicotine yourself. It's interesting to think about the womb as an environment, but most geneticists would probably call it that. There's a lot of research on the different sort of factors within the environment which can lead to or which can encourage drug use and even addiction or dependence on drugs. This is a table that simply tries to summarize a few of the basic and common factors which are identified. In general, if you're abusing drugs, you're more likely to become addicted to drugs. If you are in a family with lack of parental supervision, you're more likely to become addicted to drugs. If drugs are just readily available to you, you're more likely to become addicted to drugs than if they're not readily available. Growing up in poverty conveys all sorts of risks, including increased risk for substance dependence, etc., etc. So the point is, not all users get addicted to drugs. Some of it may be due to genetics, some of it may be due to environmental factors. And as we've seen in previous lectures, or as I hope you recall from previous lectures, the social environment, that is, the parts of the environment that have to do with how we relate to family and friends and other important people, seem to be particularly important for not entirely determining, but for contributing to drug use problems, and even addiction or dependence. So if your social group provides access to drugs, if your social group provides norms for how you should use drugs or how you should just generally behave around drugs, if your social group encourages you to hold expectations for positive effects for drug use, those are all things in your social environment which could make it more likely for you to use drugs, and maybe even use drugs in such a way that you ultimately became dependent, you became addicted to drugs. So one thing that you're maybe kind of thinking about here, or at least I hope you're thinking about, is this kind of nature and nurture, genes and environment balance, or the total variability is the whole pie. What slice of the pie is genes? What slice of the pie is environment? It's worth noting that for any one person, it's kind of impossible to know. So if you knew a person who was addicted to heroin, let's say, it's not really a meaningful question to ask, well, what percentage of the fact that you became addicted to heroin is because of your genes, and what percentage of the fact is because of your environment? You could look at that person and hopefully you could ask him or ask her to describe their family background, to describe their environment. You might find that, this person's parents used heroin. Perhaps there's some genetic risk that they passed along, or this person grew up in an impoverished environment where heroin was readily available and where there were other risk factors. Perhaps that played a role. But for any one person, you can't do the math. What you can do is, with a population of people, you can say, like, for the population of people in America, or for the population of college-age folks, we can roughly estimate the fraction of the variability in a behavior, in this case addiction, which is due to genes and which is due to environment. And maybe a really important point to take here is that most behavior, including most patterns of substance use, is a product of both genetic influences and environmental influences, whether we consider the whole population of folks or whether we really even focus on one person. It's rarely the case that we can say that any behavior, including something as complicated as substance use, is entirely due to genes or entirely due to environment. So an important idea here is not all users are the same. Some have relatively more risk for dependence, some have relatively less risk. A person who has genetic risk for becoming addicted to, say, cannabis, to marijuana, and who has environmental risks might be more likely to become dependent than someone who doesn't have those same levels of risk. Another important idea here is I hope that thinking about this stuff makes you a little bit more compassionate or empathic, less likely to blame and shame people who have drug use problems. Now, I'm not saying that you do any of these things, but I've certainly heard people, even people I like, people who I otherwise respect, say things like the following: I quit using insert whatever drug, so this person should be able to as well. I quit smoking, so these people who just keep on smoking, why don't they just quit? They should be able to. I did it, so they can do it too. Oh, I used to drink too much, and I just went cold turkey. I gave up drinking, so I see this person who keeps on drinking, he's weak or he's stupid. I'm going to blame him or shame him for his bad behavior. I don't think that's a very nice way to be. I hope you wouldn't want to be that way anyway, but if you reflect a little bit on what we're learning about drug use and drug use behaviors and dependence to drugs, it seems pretty clear to me that different people have different risks for using, and that drug use, especially dependence, is a really complicated behavior. So we should resist simple statements like, it's easy to quit, or if you want to quit, you just have to do this. You just have to do some simple step. And I think, just to be nice people, we should especially resist the urge to shame people who have drug problems or blame them for drug problems just because we think it's easy, because it's almost never easy. And the science backs up that point, I think, quite well. So again, hopefully you're not the type of person who shames people who use drugs or who are addicted to drugs, or blames them or gets angry at them. I suppose a certain amount of frustration is understandable, but hopefully you're not trying to be mean. And maybe even more importantly, if you're listening and if you're paying attention and thinking, hopefully you see that there's plenty of reason to believe that drug use behavior is complicated, and it's not as simple as saying that people can just easily quit. Most people can't, and there are all sorts of good reasons why they can't. Okay, so far in the first lecture for the Lecture 2 series, I talked about toxicity. In this lecture, I talked about dependence. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk about social problems, or at least problems like violence and crime that are associated with drug use. This is the third way of thinking about the riskiness or dangerousness of using drugs. So I hope you're looking forward to that lecture. I am looking forward to it. But before we get there, hopefully you have a little chance to relax, maybe go outside, enjoy some time resting and reflecting, doing something pleasant. As I always say, thanks for your attention, and I'll be back in the next lecture. I hope you will too. All right, bye-bye.